The hospital waiting room smelled of disinfectant and desperation, a place where time moved differently for those who sat in its plastic chairs. Among the worried faces and hushed conversations sat a young man named Daniel, his head buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He was 23 years old, fresh out of college, and drowning in a nightmare that began 3 months ago when his mother collapsed at work. The diagnosis came swift and merciless. Stage 4 cancer. Aggressive. Expensive. The kind that doesn't negotiate or wait for convenient timing. Daniel had exhausted every option he could think of. He'd sold his car, maxed out credit cards, started 3 different fundraisers online that barely scraped together enough for a single treatment. His mother needed surgery, specialized care, medications that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The hospital bills stacked up like cruel reminders that hope came with a price tag he couldn't afford. If you believe that compassion should always triumph over circumstance, that miracles can come from the most unexpected places, and that no family should face impossible choices alone, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with everyone you know, comment below, and subscribe to Mr. Teller. Together we remind the world that humanity still exists when it matters most. That particular evening, Daniel sat in the waiting room after another difficult conversation with a hospital administrator. They were kind but firm. Without payment, they couldn't proceed with the next phase of treatment. His mother had maybe 6 weeks without it. He felt like he was watching her slip away in slow motion, powerless to stop it. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to his breaking heart. Other families came and went, some with relief on their faces, others with grief. Daniel remained, unable to leave, unable to face going home to the empty apartment where his mother's reading glasses still sat on the coffee table, waiting for her return. An older gentleman entered the waiting room, distinguished-looking with silver hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen his share of hospital corridors. He carried himself with quiet dignity. He took a seat 2 chairs away from Daniel, respecting the unspoken boundary of grief. For a while, neither spoke. The man simply sat there, present in the way that strangers rarely are anymore. Then, without turning his head, the older man spoke softly. He asked if Daniel was all right, though the answer was obvious. Daniel wiped his eyes, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment, and managed to say he was fine, just tired. The older man nodded slowly, not believing the lie, but respecting it nonetheless. What happened in the next hour would shatter everything Daniel thought he knew about kindness and possibility. The man introduced himself simply as Robert. He didn't pry, didn't push, but something about his gentle presence made Daniel's carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. The words started spilling out, first in fragments, then in floods. He told Robert about his mother, about the cancer, about the impossible bills, and the feeling of helplessness that consumed him. He talked about how his mother had raised him alone after his father left, how she worked 2 jobs to put him through school, how she never complained even when her own dreams got buried under the weight of survival. He explained how she'd tell him every night that education was the only inheritance she could give him, and he'd better make it count. Now here he was, educated and employed, but still utterly unable to save the person who'd saved him countless times. Robert listened with the kind of attention that felt like prayer. He didn't interrupt with hollow reassurances or cheap optimism. He simply absorbed every word as if Daniel's pain mattered, as if this story needed to be heard. When Daniel finally fell silent, exhausted from the weight of speaking his worst fears aloud, Robert sat quietly for a moment before asking a single question. He asked what Daniel's mother's name was. The question seemed strange, almost irrelevant, but Daniel answered. Her name was Catherine Morrison, an elementary school teacher who'd touched hundreds of young lives before cancer forced her into early retirement. Robert stood up slowly, his knees creaking slightly with age, and excused himself. He told Daniel he needed to make a phone call and would return shortly. Daniel nodded absently, assuming the man was simply being polite, finding a gentle way to extract himself from a stranger's tragedy. People did that. They listened for a few minutes, offered sympathetic words, then retreated back to their own lives. Daniel didn't blame them. Why should anyone else carry his burden? He leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, closing his eyes against the harsh lights, trying to find some small pocket of peace in the chaos. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Daniel assumed Robert had left, disappeared into whatever life awaited him beyond these walls. But then footsteps approached, and Robert returned, settling back into his seat with a slight smile that seemed to carry secrets. He asked Daniel if he'd eaten anything today. Daniel couldn't remember. Food felt irrelevant when your whole world was collapsing. Robert pulled out his phone, ordered 2 sandwiches from a nearby deli, and insisted they'd arrive soon. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless in the scope of Daniel's crisis, but something about it made his throat tighten with unexpected gratitude. They sat together as evening deepened into night, talking about everything and nothing. Robert shared stories about his own mother, who'd passed away 2 decades ago from heart disease. He spoke about the regrets that lingered, the conversations left unfinished, the gratitude that came too late. He told Daniel that presence mattered more than perfection, that showing up was sometimes the only thing we could offer. Daniel felt some of the crushing weight lift, if only temporarily, replaced by the strange comfort of being truly seen by another human being. If this story is stirring something in your heart, if it's reminding you that we're all connected by our struggles and our capacity for compassion, please don't keep scrolling without liking this video, sharing it everywhere, and subscribing to Mr. Teller. Leave a comment telling us about a time when a stranger's kindness changed your perspective. Your words might give someone else the courage to keep going. Around 9 that evening, a hospital administrator approached Daniel with a confused expression. She asked if his name was Daniel Morrison, if his mother was Catherine Morrison, currently in room 417. Daniel's heart seized, terrified of what news she might bring. He confirmed both, his voice barely steady. The administrator looked down at her clipboard, then back at him with something like wonder in her eyes. She said there had been a development, that someone had paid his mother's entire hospital bill, all outstanding charges, and all projected future treatments. She said the surgery was scheduled for the following morning, that the best specialist had been consulted, that everything his mother needed would be provided. Daniel couldn't process the words. They sounded like a language he didn't speak, a reality that couldn't possibly belong to his life. He asked who had done this, demanded to know, his voice rising with desperate confusion. The administrator said the donor wished to remain anonymous, that all she could share was that the payment had been made in full less than an hour ago. Daniel turned to Robert, the only person who'd known the details, the only person who'd heard Catherine's name. Robert stood slowly, placing a hand briefly on Daniel's shoulder, and told him that sometimes angels don't announce themselves. They simply do what needs doing and slip away. Before Daniel could speak, before he could ask the questions burning in his chest, Robert walked toward the exit. Daniel chased after him, calling out, but Robert simply turned, smiled with eyes that held both sadness and joy, and said that Daniel should focus on his mother now, that everything else was just details. He said that years ago someone had helped him when he needed it most, and he'd spent his life trying to pay that kindness forward. He told Daniel that one day, when he was able, he should do the same for someone else. Then he disappeared through the automatic doors into the night, leaving Daniel standing in the fluorescent glow of the hospital entrance, tears streaming down his face, clutching the truth that miracles still existed. Catherine's surgery was successful. The recovery was long and difficult, but she survived. Daniel never saw Robert again, despite searching, despite asking hospital staff for security footage, despite hiring someone to investigate. It was as if the man had been a ghost, appearing exactly when needed and vanishing just as completely. But his impact remained, rippling through their lives in ways both large and small. Catherine returned to teaching part-time, pouring her renewed energy into her students. Daniel started a foundation in her name, helping other families navigate the impossible maze of medical bills and mounting desperation. Years later, Daniel found himself in another hospital waiting room, sitting beside a young woman sobbing quietly into her hands. Her story was different, but the desperation was familiar. Daniel listened, asked her loved one's name, and excused himself to make a phone call. He understood now that kindness doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it moves quietly, slipping under the radar, changing everything while asking for nothing in return. He learned that being saved meant accepting the responsibility to save others when the moment arrived. Before you go, I want you to think about something important. Comment below and tell me honestly, have you ever been helped by a stranger in a moment of crisis? Or have you been a stranger who helped? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now to believe that goodness still lives in this world.